Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Margaret Steele, and I'm the president of the Emergency Volunteer Corps of Nehalem Bay. I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for their interest and participation today. I'm especially grateful to our speakers for carving out time from their very busy schedules to address the topic of wildfires from each of their unique perspectives. At EVCNB, our goal is to deliver information that helps our Nehalem Bay communities be better prepared for all kinds of natural disasters, from snowstorms to tsunamis to wildfires. For the last couple of years, we have held community meetings with speakers from our local fire department and the Oregon Department of Forestry Tillamook unit, which have provided helpful information on wildfire preparation and evacuation relevant to our area. The magnitude and proximity of the wildfires during the 2020 fire season, followed by this year's early onslaught of extreme temperatures and an extended drought, has caused us to increase our attention to the issue of wildfires, to better educate ourselves and our community on this crucial topic. Our program today includes 6 Oregon leaders who will cover topics ranging from the 2021 wildfire season, real-world experience of managing megafires, and wildfire-related legislative work that took place during the last legislative session and what that work means for Oregonians. Our agenda is packed today, but we'll make every effort to allow questions to come forward from the audience. Please note that the chat box has been disabled, but you can enter your questions through the Q&A box at any time throughout the webinar. A moderator is standing by to pass questions along to our panelists. And if time doesn't allow questions to be addressed during the webinar, we will ask our panelists to respond to us later in writing, and we will pass that information on to you, our audience. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first 2 speakers. Doug Graff began his career with the Oregon Department of Forestry in 2003 as a stewardship forester. He joined the Fire Protection Division as Fire Operations Manager in 2009 and assumed the position of Deputy Chief of the Division in 2013 and then became Chief of Fire Protection in 2015. Travis Medema is Oregon's Chief Deputy State Fire Marshal, having come from the Oregon Department of Forestry with more than 26 years of operations experience. Recognized for his experience with budget, fire operations, legislative policy, and process, and coming off the 2020 wildfire season, Travis was seen as possessing the skill set that would serve the Oregon State Fire Marshal in a time when it was needed the most. Gentlemen, I turn it over to you.
Okay, good day. Thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. We'll share this screen in just 1 second. Travis and I will walk through a presentation as described. And first and foremost, just want to shout out to all those community members who engage in emergency response. Every emergency in this state starts locally and ends locally, and it impacts our local communities. It takes volunteerism like this organization and your participation today to be successful. It's an honor to be here and serve Oregonians. Today we'll present drought conditions, a short history of the last 3 decades as we consider large fires across Oregon's landscape, the current conditions we face today on the 2021 fire season, a few key statistics, and then thoughts moving forward relative to living with wildfire. And I turn now to Travis for any opening remarks, and then we'll share our screen.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Real honor and pleasure to be here with you today. I would want to also just give a quick shout out to our local fire service. As you look across the board and you look at fire seasons over the last decade, they've challenged the state of Oregon, and at each and every juncture of a challenging situation where wildfires are threatening communities, your local fire service and your local fire departments have really stepped up over 70% of the response in the state of Oregon to conflagration acts are from volunteers. And just a real special shout out to each and every one of your local fire departments, the role that they play in protecting Oregonians and their commitment to public safety. And just can't personally thank the Oregon Fire Service enough for everything they do statewide in helping protect our communities. So thank you.
Okay, I'll begin sharing the screen now, and we'll start with the first slide, introduction slide here, as we just touched, and we'll now move to drought conditions. And this has been the real driver and a real narrative for Oregon over the past, just approaching now a full decade, when we first experienced drought conditions in Southeast Oregon in 2012, and we burned over 1 million acres in Southeast Oregon that year. Since then, drought has been a constant companion for us in Oregon. And in the beginning of 2021 fire season, it was clear again that we had challenges in 2021 fire season. And this graphic really details specifically where the drought conditions are the most extreme. This is exceptional drought area in South Central Oregon over Klamath and Lake counties. And really keep an eye on that area as we look through the series of presentations here. We knew this was going to be a challenge as early as April. Much of the state was in either extreme, severe, or exceptional drought. About 47% of the state, particularly on the east slope of the Cascades, have some challenges. As we fast forward into September, certainly an extreme change, and this truly is the message relative to our experience with fires this fire season. We shifted to 99% of the state in some condition of either exceptional, extreme, or severe drought conditions. And again, maintained across that east slope of the Cascade, and certainly moved into our area in Northwest Oregon late in the season. The next series of slides would provide us some context relative to where have we seen fire over the last 3 decades. So we're going to look back 30 years to give context to this fire season as it relates to the past 30 years. And we're going to take this in 10-year increments. So from 1992 to 2001, this was where we were experiencing fires. This is the fire perimeters in red across the state. And across this decade, we averaged just under 200,000 acres burned on a 10-year average across Oregon on all jurisdictions, federal lands, private lands, range lands, tribal lands, wheat country in North Central Oregon, forest lands, and in and around our communities. About 200,000 acres burned. In the next 10-year period, from 2002 to 2011, we see a stacked increase in fire activity. Certainly, we see the Biscuit fire in Southwest Oregon start up. That was 500,000 acres burned in this region. Extremely complex fire, but you see the concentration and the size of fires increasing across the decades. As we move to the current decade on the next slide, we were at 315,000 acres burned on average, 10-year average on this 10-year period. Now, the most recent 10-year period from 2012 to 2021, we're approaching 720,000 acres burned. So a doubling each of the decades, the size and concentration and the era of mega fires, if you will, is clear. I think apparent as you study these maps, you begin to see reburns. So fire conditions, we will see fire back on the landscape in the same place we had in previous years. And then finally, back to the drought slides, I would draw attention to South Central Oregon, Klamath Lake. Now, this is truly the 2021 fire experience showing up here. really isolated right over where we saw that exceptional drought starting at the beginning of the season. So no surprise relative to the challenges. This map also has the dramatic 2020 fire season fires on the map. So we have Beachy and Lions Head, Riverside, Farm, and Archie Creek fires along the west slope of the Cascades during the September 7th Labor Day fire events from last year. The point I mentioned in Southeast Oregon when we first saw the drought conditions, a lot of these large fires are from 2012. And this is the first indications of drought we had where we saw these large mega fires in Southeast Oregon. So where does that take us today? Where do we stand in 2021 fire season? Now we've, on average, we experience about 2,000 fires across all jurisdictions in Oregon, and we're right there. We're on pace to finish the year a little bit ahead of average across all jurisdictions in Oregon at about 2,000 fires. We're currently at 1,860 fires experienced across the state, and we burned 816,000 acres across the state, with the large majority of those fires down again in that Lake and Klamath counties where we had the drought conditions set in early. So we've outpaced our 10-year average on acres burned this year, and we're right about average statewide on numbers of fires. This map also shows where the Department of Forestry, who I serve, deployed incident management teams, and I'll turn over here shortly to Travis Medema, Chief Deputy, to talk about the structural fire protection responsibilities and their team deployments. And Travis will take it from here relative to key statistics from the structural protection side of the equation. Travis?
Thanks, Chief Graff. You know, as folks have seen, as you look at kind of the conditions leading up into the 2021 fire season, you know, I'd characterize it really at the meta level as another very challenging fire season. It's marked by the third largest fire in recent history in Oregon, the bootleg fire, as Doug pointed out, down there in Southeast Oregon. Really driven by drought and fuel conditions. And, you know, we've continued to see that in the last decade, where these drought and extended fuel conditions, you know, really are problematic and drive wildfires. Additionally, you know, from my perspective, this is almost 28 years in this business. You know, I'd characterize the 2021 fire season as really, you know, starting early and lasting longer than, you know, we may have historically faced. So, for the Office of State Fire Marshal, it started very early up in kind of north central Oregon, the wheat country. So you'll see kind of Rentham Market is a spot there where the Office of State Fire Marshal deployed incident management teams to a series of fires in late June. You know, at the meta level, as I kind of reflect back on this map and look at the fires that we dealt with in the 2021 wildfire season, with this much fire on the landscape and the challenging conditions that existed, there are some really significant successes from the 2021 fire season in terms of, you know, protecting life and protecting property from the Office of State Fire Marshal. And you know, a lot of that hinged on critical investments that the legislature made and the governor's office, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But so I look at this map and I think about and reflect on the 2021 wildfire season. You know, very challenging year, but also a very successful year. The Office of State Fire Marshal deployed to 9 conflagrations, and so our 3 incident management teams were extremely active. We also this year, for the first time, used some of the funding from the legislature to, you know, do this immediate response. So pre-conflagration, mobilizing resources early and inserting those in and around communities to help protect them. And then also pre-positioning of resources. So in the front of some kind of a significant event, whether that was lightning or whether that was a wind event, pre-mobilizing resources so that they would be in local communities that potentially could be threatened should a fire start and should a fire impact a community. Themes for the Office of State Fire Marshal out of this fire season, statewide, we were actively busy. You can see the map from Northeast Oregon down to South Central Oregon, all along the crest of the Cascades. And really, as we think about it, the response posture that was needed to manage this much fire on the landscape pushed the Oregon Fire Service. However, clearly it responded as you look at the outcomes of the 2021 fire season. Very few times this summer, as I look back, were there periods of time where the Oregon Fire Service, your local fire service, your local firefighters weren't engaged in some community across Oregon. And again, to my opening comments, thanking the local fire service. They are the ones that are responding to communities all across the state when fire threatens them. So as I look at this and reflect, very active year, very busy with 9 conflagrations and structural resources spread out all across the state to protect Oregonians and their communities. Thanks, Doug. So as I kind of look at the next level down, some more facts and kind of stats, we call it by the numbers. 57 task forces were mobilized, and a task force is the makeup of 5 engines. So those are pretty significant numbers in terms of structural resources mobilized around the state. And that's all done through the Oregon Fire Mutual Aid System, which is how we mobilize resources and incident management teams to protect communities. Due to the workload and due to the magnitude of the 2021 fire season, we did use strike teams from out of the state of Oregon, and we have a process where we can bring in additional resources, much like our wildland partners. We use a thing called the Emergency Management Compact Act to do that, EMAC. And so at times for the bootleg fire and for fires in Northeast Oregon, we brought structural task forces in from California, Utah, and Washington. Across the state, there are 305 fire agencies. So you can see over a third of the fire agencies across the state were involved in the 2021 fire season, with 121 different fire agencies responding to local communities that were threatened by wildfire. Almost 400 pieces of fire apparatus were moved around the state, along with 800 plus personnel were assigned to either large fires or pre-positioned in communities to protect them from fires. Again, as Chief Graff mentioned, it was a challenging year in terms of acres burned. And, I can't underscore this enough, 802,000 acres burned in the state of Oregon. So significant as we think about fire season and the impacts to Oregon's forest and rangeland. Next slide, Doug. Lastly, to put all of this in context is to the work of the Oregon Fire Service and the Office of State Fire Marshal. Over 12,000 structures were threatened. Many of those down in Southern Oregon on the bootleg fire in Klamath and Lake counties. You can see the estimated value of those residents that were saved. So significant impact in terms of the role that the Oregon Fire Mutual Aid System plays, the Conflagration Act, supporting locals when local resources are tapped out and there are need for additional structure assets to protect Oregon's communities. 166 residences lost, 265 other buildings or structures lost. And our current cost to date is over $21 million for response to the 2021 wildfire season. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Travis. Moving on to by the numbers for the Department of Forestry. ODF protects approximately 16 million acres landscape across the state, forest land and grazing, and we partner and provide for a complete and coordinated fire protection system with the State Fire Marshal, our rangeland fire protective associations, and our local city and rural fire departments that Travis highlighted, along with our federal partners and tribal lands to provide fire protection to the state of Oregon. For ODF specific responsibility on the 16 million acres, here's the statistics dated on September 7th, so a subset of the total acres burned. And I share this to really highlight the distinction between lightning fires and human-caused fires. And you can see a major driver of fires in the state of Oregon, human-caused. A lot of human-caused fires on ODF protected lands because we protect those lands in and around our communities where people interact with the wildlands. And you can see the acres burned by human-caused fires. This is an area we really need to do better as a state, and we'll pay in close attention to moving forward. Large fire costs are a driver, a challenge for the state of Oregon, have been since 2013. Prior to these numbers in this graphic you're seeing, where we're in the range of gross costs, large fire cost spend over $60 million. We were less than half of that the decade prior to this. Net costs come into play because we receive recoveries from FEMA and other agency billings. You can see net costs at averaging closer to $30 million. And for 2021 fire season, really consistent relative to a difficult year for us, as the data on acres burned and numbers and fires would dictate, well over $120 million in large fire costs. We do have a unique relationship in the state of Oregon, fortunately, with a catastrophic wildfire insurance policy that has been purchased annually for the past 47 years. And over the life of that policy, we've paid in $83 million in premiums and received close to $100 million in claims against that policy. There's a $50 million deductible for that policy. And as the net costs indicate on this slide, we will be above the $50 million policy this year deductible, and in the range of about $16 million currently paid by that policy. We'll obviously work through final costs and begin specific details with the brokers as we engage with Lloyd's of London, which is our policyholder, unique in the world for the state to really diversify its financial risk portfolio. Moving on to how did we prepare for 2021 and how are we moving forward? I would just echo Deputy Chief Fire Marshal Travis Medema's comments relative to the legislature taking action. We have a roadmap before us from leadership with many volunteers who sit on the Governor's Wildfire Council, which really led to ultimately the passage of Senate Bill 762 and early investments by the legislature in January, recognizing we were having a challenge fire season. We added firefighters, we added aircraft and fire line leadership to ensure that we were prepared and ready with both the January investments and then the passage of Senate Bill 762. Key increases in aviation capacity is in the top right. These are called fire bosses, single engine air tankers that we deployed in the gorge country. We did not have these resources last year. So the legislature and governor's office continue to invest in fire protection for the state of Oregon. These are instrumental in immediate response on many fires in that country that Travis mentioned where they deployed early. I turn to Travis to close the presentation.
Just again would highlight and a real grateful heart for the investments made by the legislature and leadership out of the governor's office. These investments that were made early on were critical to successes in the 2021 fire season. Allowed agencies like the Office of State Fire Marshal to be more nimble, allowed us to access different resources that maybe the Department of Forestry had that we didn't have access to. And there are some significant successes. That picture there is in that north central part of Oregon, where the Office of State Fire Marshal was used in a partnership with the Department of Forestry. We were able to access those aircraft and those aircraft saved a significant large fire from being on the landscape. And without those investments and without that leadership, I personally believe the 2021 wildfire season would have been significantly worse. Additionally, it allowed for investments to be made in the local fire service, and that was significant through some wildland urban interface grants. We were able to allocate funding to different fire departments for some really key critical wildland equipment that was needed so that your local fire departments could be prepared and ready to respond, and also respond when the Conflagration Act was called. These investments, really set I think both the Oregon Department of Forestry and Office of State Fire Marshal up to deal with what we realized as a very challenging 2021 fire season. As we look to the future, again, investments by the legislature and policy and legislation passed in the last legislative session, continues to be a focus, especially as we transition out of fire season. Senate Bill 762 was one of those key capstone pieces of legislation, along with House Bill 2927 for the Office of State Fire Marshal, in really shaping our future and recognizing that wildfire is a significant risk to Oregon, and really put on a pathway where state agencies and where Oregon is heading with our wildfire problems and concerns. We continue to really look at the National Cohesive Strategy and the Governor's Wildfire Council as kind of the guiding light and north arrow in these discussions. And really, as we look to sustain fire protection and advancements into the future, it's really investments across all three of the key tenets of the National Cohesive Strategy, which is the ability for agencies to respond, how we work and engage and make communities fire adapted, and then also how we treat and manage and maintain resilient landscapes. And so as we look at those three tenets and we look at the Governor's Wildfire Council and legislation that passed, it's really set the agencies up to be successful as we move into this new era of wildfire, really looking to utilize those resources and assets, and then continue to build on those into the future, and then align with policy elements that were outlined in 762 with the Wildfire Advisory Council, and really helping shape the direction of this key legislation. As I, reflect again on the 2021 wildfire season, a very significant fire season, again, for the state of Oregon. But again, really grateful and thankful heart to each and every one of the people that stepped up and responded to help protect our communities, from our local fire service to the wildland firefighters, to our contractors, to everybody who steps up when the fire bell goes off. And just a sincere, heartfelt thanks to everybody that responded to help keep Oregonians safe.
I think we'll close that portion of the presentation as others are ready to present. And I would just offer being ready for fire season is critically important. You all know locally, the local fires that are close by, 2020, the Pike Road fire, just over 300 acres, causing evacuations just south of you. And then, of course, further south, Lincoln County, the Echo Mountain, where we lost 298 homes in 2020. These fires are becoming more active. It's statewide. We do have risk in the Northwest, as you all know, and thank you for being prepared.
Thank you very much for that very informative presentation, Doug and Travis. Our next speaker is Mark Labhart. Mark doesn't require much introduction in this part of Oregon, having served as a hardworking and well-regarded Tillamook County Commissioner for 12 years before his retirement. Some may not know about the vast experience that Mark has from 35 years with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Starting out as a seasonal wildland firefighter in Eastern Oregon, Mark worked his way up through the fire chain of command, becoming an incident commander and ultimately the only state-level person in the nation to serve as an area commander, leading firefighting efforts in large, complex fires such as the 2002 500,000 acre biscuit fire in Southern Oregon. We are pleased that Mark can bring this many years of firsthand experience into this discussion. It's all yours, Mark.
Thank you, Margaret. And it's good to see you again. And also to thank the Nehalem Bay Emergency Volunteer Corps for sponsoring this. I'm going to drill deeper. Doug and Travis talked at the 50,000 foot level. I'm going to talk about a number of questions I've received over my 47 years, and to be exact, even as I was a county commissioner, I was being called out to work on fires around the state at a what they call a MAC level, multi-agency coordination level. So I'm going to talk about several questions. I'm going to read answers, so I apologize for that because I want to make sure I capture everything. But some questions that I hear over those 47 years, one I hear a lot is, where do you get those fire names from? Usually fire is named by the arriving initial attack incident commander. Most of the time, fires are named from nearby geographic features, such as creeks or valleys. And sometimes we get it wrong. And I'll give you an example of where we got it wrong. The Biscuit Fire, which was about 500,000 acres, I think it was the largest fire in Oregon's history now, was previously named the Florence Fire because it was started near Florence Creek. And as time went on, the city of Florence lobbied very strongly for us to change the name of the fire from Florence to Biscuit, and which was Biscuit Creek near there. And the reason was people thought the town of Florence was on fire and it was affecting their tourism. So, yep, we changed the name and we changed it to Biscuit Fire. So many people may not know that. What about who leads particular firefighting efforts? Wildfires are given a rating from type 3 incidents to 5, and those are usually the less dangerous incidents on the landscape. And then type 1 incidents are what we call the most dangerous fire. About, as Chief Graff said, about 94% of all fires fall into that type 3 and 5 category and are put out by the local initial attack crews. So thanks to the legislature for that funding. And that's the reason that we have a lot of those fires with initial attack, both from structural and wildland resources. Type 1 incidents are usually assigned an incident management team. And as said before, ODF has 3 incident management teams. The U.S. Forest Service has multiple incident management teams that they can draw from. The IC or incident commander is responsible for the overall supervision and command of the command and general staff of the incident management team. And that person sets the objectives for the fire suppression effort. Incident management teams are usually made up of very experienced firefighters. The size of the team varies. It depends upon the size and complexity of the fire. Major sections of the management team include an operations section, which is the online fire supervisors, the planning section, which develop fire strategy maps, locations, and divisions where all resources, crews, engines, helicopters, et cetera, are assigned to. Finance section chief, which tracks and pays the cost of the fire. And last but not least is the logistics section, which covers things like feeding all those firefighters, bathrooms for all those firefighters, showers, drinking water, fire camp locations, security, and a lot more. Third question, how are evacuations set up and how are they administered? Get this question a lot. The IC, working with his command and general staff, they consider fire behavior, predicted weather, risk to human life, and the amount of time it will take to evacuate people, pets, livestock when making the decision. His team works very closely with the local law enforcement to do the best they can to ensure that an orderly evacuation well ahead of an approaching fire. They also work with local Red Cross and volunteer organizations for shelter locations for evacuees, including pets and livestock. The worst case scenario is when an order has been given to shelter in place where there is no time to escape an oncoming fire, where it would be too hazardous to evacuate. It only takes one tree falling across an evacuation road to go from an orderly evacuation to a horrendously dangerous situation. Next question, how do firefighters protect houses when the fire is close? During the firefight, firefighters will what we call triage homes to determine if it can be saved or not. Building materials and nearby vegetations are big factors in decision-making. A metal roof versus a shake roof. Vegetation cleared around the home. Firewood stacked either next to the house or away from the house. if the crews have time, they can do what we call burnout around a house to reduce the vegetation. They can then save the home from an approaching fire. This takes time. It takes resources away from attacking the main fire. So it is always better to have that home pre-prepped by the homeowner in the spring, well before a fire approaches in the summer or fall. Next question, how has technology helped firefighters? It used to be that we had lookout towers with people in them watching out for fires. Technology has changed this over time. In remote areas, they now can use high-definition tower-mounted cameras armed with artificial intelligence that can discern smoke plume from fog. There are something like 800 cameras scattered across the Pacific Northwest now. Drones are becoming a standard use because they can fly into smoke, have infrared capabilities to spot fire fronts and the direction of the fire front. Satellite imagery can plot smoke direction and ashfall. We now have technology to map lightning strikes down to almost pinpoint locations, so aircraft and crews can go and check out that location to see if that downstrike actually started a fire or not. What's the best time of day to attack a fire? Short answer, it's as quick as it starts, but in some cases, fires are well on their way before they are detected or resources can get to them in a timely manner. In that case, the best time of day to attack a fire is when it is hopefully laid down somewhat. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, fires lay down at night when the air is cooler, humidity is higher, and the wind may die down. As the day heats up, the humidity goes down, the winds pick up, and fires will pick up in intensity, and it's more difficult to get up next to the fire and safely stop it. Are wildfires harder to fight in timber or grass? You would think that grass would be easier to stop, right? Not necessarily so. Grass fires tend to be very fast spreaders. High winds make grass fires very dangerous to firefighters. Timber fires tend to be on average slower spreaders. Not in all cases, but on average, they tend to be slower spreaders, but are significantly more difficult to extinguish. You have seen this philosophy turned out on its head in the last few years, though. Last year's Labor Day fires ran many miles in a very short period of time, driven by strong east winds. This year, because of severe drought conditions, some fires like the Bootleg made major runs for several days in a row. Firefighters had to back off several miles and regroup to plan different form of attack for what we call direct attack to indirect attack. Next question. When are firefighting aircraft like retardant planes and helicopters deployed on fires, and why? The best and most effective use of retardant bombers is early in the fire when it's small and they can lay down retardant in a flanking action, or to stop the head of the fire when it is small. They become less effective if the fire is out of control. Helicopters are effective in dropping water on specific spot fires or to cool down areas next to the fire line, to give firefighters a chance to stop a slop over or slow the spread. Helicopters are also particularly valuable in transporting crews into inaccessible areas where otherwise it would be the long walk. Aircraft is also very effective in dropping smoke jumpers into areas that are remote. So why do firefighters let some fires burn? Get that question a lot. Sometimes small fires in wilderness areas or national parks are allowed to creep around as they are achieving their land management objectives, and it reduces fuel loads. The dilemma is when they get close to the boundaries and come off of the wilderness and onto private land. Fire is an important land management tool in Eastern Oregon forests when done correctly, and it reduces fuel loading. And in these fire adapted regimes, it is an important tool for fire, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's best to do what we call prescribed burning. And prescribed burning is where you go into an area either in the spring when it's wet or in the fall after the fall rains have hit, and you can reduce fuel loads by doing what we call prescribed burning. In other words, it's a prescription on the ground where it's very safe to go in and burn areas with low intensity ground fires. And it also produces good wildlife habitat. And in most cases, prescribed burns produce less smoke than wildfires. There's a significant amount of carbon that's released in large conflagration fires like Doug and Travis talked about. And there's less in an area where you're doing prescribed burning. Usually these type of prescribed fires are done under very, very controlled conditions and produce, again, a lot less smoke and don't consume all the fuel. So you'll see, I had the privilege of serving on the Governor's Wildfire Council, and we talked about this a lot. And I'm, for a lot of you know, I was managed the majority of the Tillamook State Forest for about 20 years. And I saw where thinnings, pre-commercial thinnings and commercial thinnings open up the stand and reduce the fuel loading. And that's a big problem that we have in forests on the east side of the Cascades where I live now in Sisters. We have a lot of forests that, because of fire prevention over time, we've got a lot of forests that are overstocked and stagnated. And these are fire regime forests where fire has historically been an integral part of the landscape, where fires have come through and burnt into areas on a ground fire basis every few years. But with fire suppression over time, these forests have grown into stagnated places where you have what they call ladder fuels. Ladder fuels are, if you have like what's behind me right now, sagebrush, grass, and then it goes up into lower hanging small trees and then goes up into the canopy. Fire likes to go up, heat rises and it gets up into those canopies and then starts crown fires and off they go with strong winds. But if you can go in there and reduce the fuel loading in these overstocked stands, either by prescribed burning and or thinnings, pre-commercial thinnings or commercial thinnings, you save those ponderosa pine forests, which are mostly fire resistance in normal fire conditions, and you can have a productive forest. You can protect communities, and you can have what I would call a well-managed forest for wildlife habitat. And so we need to get used to prescribed burning and pre-commercial and commercial thinnings in our forests throughout Oregon, particularly on the east side of the Cascades, where fire is a normal part of the landscape. So I wanted to leave time. I've got till 1:50, so I've got about 10 minutes. I wanted to particularly leave time to answer questions that folks might have, either about some of the questions that I answered or other questions. So let me see. I've got one, looks like right now, and that is wind being tracked? Is climate change increasing general wind conditions and direction? Well, wind is being tracked every day. The National Weather Service puts out forecasts in the morning and in the evening, in the afternoon, about what the weather conditions are going to be for that afternoon and that next day. And they'll talk about particularly humidity, whether there's going to be a wind event, what direction is coming from, whether it's an east wind or what we call a cold front, which comes in off the coast and comes into Western Oregon, then comes over the top of the Cascades. And when it does that, it produces very strong winds. An example that happened last year at the Labor Day fires is the cold front was pretty much on the east side of the Cascades and came down and produced very strong easterly winds. And we had a number of fires that were up on the landscape in the Cascades at that time and produced exceptionally strong winds and drove those fires through those old growth Douglas fir stands and went right down, as we saw, into communities, and was a very, very dangerous situation with lives lost, communities lost. And it was very difficult for the firefighters to get ahead of that, to be able to attack it. So Jill is asking a question about why choose thinning over prescribed burning or vice versa. It's not a choice of either or, it's and, in my opinion. And cost is a factor. In fact, I think the Forest Service has lobbied very strongly to secure some more funding for both prescribed burnings and thinnings. So it's not a choice of one or the other. In some places, the stands are very thick. They've got what we call lodgepole pine stands over here that can grow up dog hair thick, and you can go in there and thin those and open them up, and then come in later with a prescribed burn. So got another question from Leanne Thompson. Hi, Leanne, County Commissioner from Clatsop County, good friend. How can county commissioners get this information in concise form so we can partner with the governor's efforts? How can we all educate the public and help reduce human-caused fires? Well, send this webinar out to all your friends, maybe even play it for one of the county commissioner meetings or to get the word out. Education is extremely important. State Fire Marshal's office provides a lot of education, so does ODF. So reach out to Travis and Doug, and they can get you all the information and specifics that you want in a concise manner, Commissioner, so that you can get it out to your citizens that you represent and other citizens in Clatsop County. Jack has a question. How effective has the use, if used, of DSP satellites in fighting large fires? I wish I knew what DSP satellites are, but I know satellites are an extremely important part. The weather forecast that the National Weather Service puts out in Portland, Medford, and Pendleton every day, they have a number of different satellites. They have a visual satellite that you can look at, and they can put animation into it so you can see what the cloud movements are. They have infrared satellites that get you the infrared. There's water vapor. You can get it in all kinds of different formats. And then the meteorologist they're fire meteorologists, so they'll predict what the danger of fire is going to be. And they predict lightning ahead of time. And they have what they call LALs, which is lightning activity levels, where they'll predict from 1 to 6, I think it is, about the lightning activity level. And you don't want to get to a 6 lightning activity level because it's getting pretty bad then, and you're going to have what we call dry lightning. And dry lightning is lightning that comes down, hits the ground, and there's usually rain with it, but it's so hot or high base thunderstorms where it evaporates before it hits the ground. So it's just like fire coming from the sky that doesn't get rained on. And you want wet thunderstorms. That's thunderstorms that have rain that does hit the ground. So you do not want dry thunderstorms. And that's what hit a portion of the Cascades this summer, was some dry lightning storms. And then the Klamath Falls area, when you got some dry lightning down there, that started a number of fires. Steve asked a question, how do forest stands in Tillamook County compare to stands elsewhere in terms of fire susceptibility? And this is an interesting answer I'll give you, because it depends. Most of the time, west side forests tend to be less fire risk most of the time. You did not see that last year because of the wind conditions that we had with the fires that burnt in Tillamook County and Lincoln County and in the Cascades. Actually, I've been fighting fire for 47 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened last year at the Labor Day fires. I think a lot of experienced firefighters have never seen a situation so horrendous and so terrible that we had last year. And so West Side fire can be very dangerous. A classic example is the Tillamook burn. That started from an east wind condition. The 3 Tillamook fires, well, there are actually 4. Those fires, I'm going to make sure I've got time here. I've got to stop in about 2 minutes here. Fires are susceptible on the west side, not as bad as on the east side, but they are part of the landscape over there. But I would say it's not as dangerous a situation, except in certain circumstances, east winds, as it is on the east side. I used the term dog hair thicket. Dog hair, if you've ever pet your dog, you can't hardly see their skin because there's so much hair on their back. Well, that's what some of the stands in Eastern Oregon look like. They're so thick you can hardly walk through them, or it's just tree stands that are very, very thick. That's what I call dog hair stands. Last question: are there fire risk maps similar to our flooding maps that are accessible and understandable to the public? I think Doug is still on, and he can probably answer that question, but I think there are some fire risk map out there. So maybe Doug can answer that question rather than me. I rapid fire through that as my time is up.
Thank you so much, Mark. And it's very good to see you and hear all that really interesting and useful info. Our next speakers will discuss a different aspect of wildfires. As the frequency of megafires increases, so does the threat to our everyday lives. Our legislators are taking on the issues presented by this threat, and in the most recent legislative session, they accomplished a number of things to improve Oregon's fire resiliency. Today, you'll hear about a couple of these accomplishments. I'd like to introduce Representative Paul Evans from Oregon District 20, which includes portions of Marion and Polk counties. Now serving his fourth term in the Oregon House of Representatives, one of his priority issues has been emergency preparedness. He has served as chair of the House Committee on Veterans and Emergency Management during the 3 regular sessions since 2017. In the 2021 session, Representative Evans was a chief sponsor of House Bill 2927, a bill which modernizes the structure of the Oregon State Fire Marshal and Office of Emergency Management to adapt to new emerging crises. We are grateful to have Representative Evans here today to interpret the benefits of this critical legislation for Oregonians as we go forward.
Thank you. I am Paul Evans, and I want to thank Margaret for the opportunity to be here. It's always good to see the chiefs, Commissioner Labhart, who I had the opportunity to work with in the past, and certainly Senator Betsy Johnson, who is a champion for all parts of the coast in Oregon. In the time I have allotted, what I'm hoping to be able to do is tell you why we did, what we did, and what's next. So those are the 3 major points we're going to try to get to. I want to begin with a recognition of a problem. And that problem is that sometimes over the last 20 years, many people in government have forgotten that the most important primary function of government in terms of why it's even in existence is to prepare, respond, and to recover from major disasters. For good or for ill, emergency management is not a very sexy subject for most folks until we have major events. And by that time, it's too late. So I want to just say how much I am grateful for the work of Senator Johnson and all the legislature to be able to put into practice House Bill 2927, which really was a response to the problem of command and control. Over the last many years, many different governors and administrations have forgotten that the best way to approach a problem is with centralized command and decentralized control, meaning that there is a clear structure of what needs to occur and the powers are provided, but you also allow the systems and structures to be aligned in a way that they can execute the mission most efficiently and effectively. If we could put the slide up, I'll show you what we've done. I think the slide is coming up. All right, the 2 colors are this. The gold, I want to emphasize the gold are folks who are members of what you have probably heard of in the past, the Oregon Homeland Security Council. The blue are simply just elements of the overall structure. So what we did in 2927 is effectively 4 things. First, we pulled the state police out of fire marshal. I should say we pulled the fire marshal out of state police. We separated the emergency management function from the military department. We established a 24-hour emergency operations center, and we created something called the Emergency Preparedness Advisory Committee. So I will take each one in turn. To begin with, the Oregon State Police and Oregon State Fire Marshal's offices to date are led by good people with big hearts who try to do the best they can. But in many situations, you have a competing budgetary fight over priorities. One of the things that the former superintendent of state police told me is about 2 years ago was that it's really hard for him to be able to be effective at trying to get more troopers on the ground when he's trying to explain why $20 and $30 and $40 million fire budgets have to take priority. Similarly, the Oregon Emergency Management Office that is now going to be its own department, housed in the military department, at one point seemed like a reasonable idea because of the value of logistics and simplicity of command and control within the military department. However, for those of you familiar with FEMA training is based on the local incident commander, and it is bottom up. And if some of you who have had time in the military understand that military decision-making is a top-down process. And what we lost was a lot of local input, and we in many ways missed opportunities to operationalize and to optimize available resources. So first, we realigned so that each of these functions are standalone direct to the governor appoints. Then we focused on specific aspects, especially in fire and OEM, of areas where we needed to concentrate more effort. Under Fire Marshal, we are working with the chief and ODF to ensure that the regional teams are building local capacity as well as long-term investments in capital investments for structures, for equipment, for other types of tools. And that allows a particular set of discussions related to the funding of organizations that benefit from that type of activity. Under Oregon Emergency Management, what we've done, we have in the process of standing up a 24-hour emergency operations center. The critical nature of that is Oregon really, until we made this change, was one of very few states that had a reactive system. When the balloon went up, a quote unquote warm ECC, coordination center, would then staff up. And the idea is that when you can buy down in terms of the cost of lives and property, the size and scale of the disaster, the better off you are. So by having a 24-hour EOC, minimally staffed, what we will do is two things. Number one, as an event starts to build, we will be able to provide opportunities and options for the incident commanders. And we will also be able to, during times when there's not an event going on statewide, use that position to be able to call through and make sure that the local governments, the fire districts, the police districts, the other types of emergency management partners are getting the access they need for grants, support, technical training, and basically making sure that we're doing everything we can to lead and support and coach from behind, but to give added capacity to those local folks. To ensure that we have a better read on what local governments need, the second thing we did was we created a local government advisory board direct to the OEM director. Many small agencies have long had frustrations with not being able to have more consistent communications with OEM on the development of and execution of grants, especially emergency management and homeland security grants. We believe this local advisory board will really do a lot to ensure trust in the process. We also moved Oregon Homeland Security Council out of the governor's office into effectively being staffed by OEM. But I want to emphasize the color chart now. The color chart, the gold, are members of OHSC. So we're not changing much about the Oregon Homeland Security Council, except that having the governor's office staff it was seen as a significant issue. We're going to be moving that over to OEM to be able to staff. The next point I want to emphasize is the Emergency Preparedness Advisory Committee. In many ways, if you can think of in terms of the traditional military cell, there's a planning cell and an operations cell. The planning cell is EPAC. It is intended to be representative of all ESF functions, partners, regional leaders. It is the all hazards alpha team to be able to communicate about major ideas, concerns, strategies to ensure that we have adequate support for those activities. The operations side of the house, of course, is the Oregon Homeland Security Council, and then again through the agencies as it relates to their missions under a declared unified command. The last thing I want to emphasize before we get to questions is we also, under OEM, we were able to get another $10 million for a second round of SPIRE grants. And for those of you not what the name is for SPIRE, it's basically strategic preparedness and recovery equipment grants. And the idea is that basically with this $10 million, we will follow on what we did with the first round, where equipment that agencies need but can't necessarily buy on their own, we basically use the power of the state to purchase it. We lease it out on a hand receipt. And the idea is that at the end of the day, folks get to use it until it's needed somewhere else. But it also is a way to get equipment into the hands of folks who have very challenged budgets and are not able to necessarily have it. I would note that 2 million of the 10 million is dedicated specifically for what used to be called USAR, the very specialized urban search and rescue training. And basically that has to do with saving lives and finding people after major structures have fallen and going into those confined space environments. They require specific equipment that not a lot of people can get to. So that's really what we did with 2927. That's a very fast overview. I'll try to respond to any questions you might have.
Representative Evans, we have a question from Logan.
Sure.
With the delinking from the military department, OMD, are we losing any ability to activate the Oregon National Guard and Air or NG for wildfire and shelter response? How has this process changed, if at all?
So if anything, it's probably simplified it, because what that means is instead of having to go through the general to get OEM to look at an issue that then maybe respond, the process now goes to way that it really works in every other state, where the county or the agency that is dealing with the emergency makes a request of the Emergency Operations Center. They basically source it out for whoever can meet that need, and then the equipment is supplied. So the realignment in many ways simplifies because, and I want to say this as carefully as I can, when a general is in charge of something, a general takes that very seriously. And a general wants to be involved in every single step along the way. And that makes sense for the management side of the house, but sometimes during a disaster, that is unfortunately a time suck. This should make it much simpler in terms of the immediate response and the support efforts.
And one more question from Robert Lane. Where is MRC and CERTs?
So MRC, the volunteer organizations, especially CERTs, they stay, CERT stays where it is under OEM. If MRC is the medical core component, ideally that would stay where it is right now. We're not trying to get in the way of those well-established relationships. That said, I will tell you in the future, what we're trying to do are three pieces. Number one, centralized credentialing, so that when volunteers and non-volunteers alike enter the fire space or the response space, we know what they can and can't do, and liability, et cetera, is handled. We're also going to be in this upcoming session trying to fund a statewide requirement for elected officials and appointed officials to have a baseline in emergency management training, along with a little bit of money for exercises so that people know what an elected should and shouldn't be doing during a disaster. And then trying to effectively put together a solid stockpile management program that, of course, could and would be used by CERT and other volunteer organizations in the execution of a mission as directed.
No more questions. Just one follow-up from Robert was to clarify where are MRC and CERTs on this chart?
They're not a state agency, so they're not on the chart. CERT is seen right now as a function. There's a CERT trainer under OEM.
And one more from Logan. Does this centralization of volunteer credit entails include counties and cities?
So here's what we're hoping to do. We're hoping to, instead of trying to create or force organizations that already have good working relationships. So for example, the medical reserve folks with Oregon Health Authority, the CERT through emergency management and other entities. DPSST is the training facility. It also in many ways for fire and volunteer fire and other activities keeps track of certain credentialing. It may not end up being in DPSST. It may be in OEM or it may be in DHS, but we're trying to find one particular place where we can standardize the credentialing process so that when we have a major event, it's a lot easier to keep track of people and their training so we know how we can best use them during long-term sustained operations. That's in the future. We don't have that going on right now. We have a work group on it. And again, it will include everybody who wants to be included in the credentialing process so that we have a simplified, standardized approach and know what we're getting when volunteers show up ready to help. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Representative Evans. That was very informative, and I'm excited about the reorganization and how we can work with everybody involved in the future as volunteers. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Dave Hunnicutt, president of the Oregon Property Owners Association. For nearly 25 years, Dave has represented Oregon property owners in the Capitol and in courts throughout Oregon to protect urban and rural property owners from excessive state and federal regulations that limit Oregonians' right to own and use private property. Dave is here to give us some highlights from the passage of Senate Bill 762, perhaps introducing some of us to the acronym WUI, W-U-I, which stands for Wildland Urban Interface, and directing our attention toward the implementation of Senate Bill 762. Mr. Hunnicutt, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. I hope someone is there. I've got a PowerPoint. If we can load that up, that would be helpful. There we go. My name's Dave Hunnicutt, as Margaret said, and I am not an elected official. I was preceded by one and will be followed by one. But I spend the bulk of my time representing property owners at the Capitol in Salem. And Senate Bill 762 was obviously a big bill for us, as it has significant both benefits and burdens to property owners. And so we were keenly involved and interested in that bill and how not only the bill itself, but how it's going to be work implemented by the various agencies that are responsible for it. So we can go to the next slide, please. Doug and Travis did a good job of explaining sort of the history, the most recent history of wildfires in Oregon. And the 2020 Labor Day wildfires, I think, served as a wake-up call for the average citizen, not so much for legislators and the agency folks who were well aware of the trend, but I think for all of us that non-fire experts about the impacts and how quickly and how devastating wildfires could be. And we lost over 4,000 homes and businesses on that as a result of those Labor Day wildfires, and it happened in multiple counties. And of course, with that, we knew that there would be in the 2021 session that concluded at the end of June that there would be some legislation to address those issues, and there obviously was. But wildfire efforts have been going on well before that, including the Governor's Council on Wildfire Response, which I think Commissioner Labhart indicated that he had served on. So we've been aware of this issue, but it was really the 2020 Labor Day wildfires that crystallized the issue for most legislators. Next slide, please. So as a result of that, by the end of the session, and really in the waning days of the session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 762. I refer to it as the BWB, which stands for Big Wildfire Bill. It's a very comprehensive wildfire bill, and it does and directs quite a few different agencies to do quite a few different things. That second bullet point where we talk about DEQ working with local governments on partnerships on air quality, and the Office of Emergency Management, which Representative Evans just talked about, updating a wildfire emergency plan, Forestry working on landscape resiliency plans, and the legislature to create a wildfire programs advisory council, which I've been appointed to and will serve on, are really important features of that bill, but they really aren't the features that will have the most impact on property owners. The features that will have of Senate Bill 762 that will have the greatest impact on property owners come from 4 different agencies: the Department of Forestry, which Doug represents on this webinar, the State Fire Marshal's office, which Travis is representing on this webinar, Dcbs, which stands for the Department of Consumer and Business Services, which will deal with the fire hardening building code standards that we'll get to, and then DLCD, that's the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which will probably introduce some changes to our land use laws as a result to implement the bill. Next slide, please. So we're going to start there's sort of an order of things that 762 spells out, and we'll start with the statewide map of wildfire risk, because that really is the precursor to all of this, and all of the agencies will work based on that statewide map. What the bill does, it requires the Department of Forestry to create a statewide map of wildfire risk, where every single parcel in Oregon, from a condo in Beaverton to a 10,000 acre ranch in Grant County, will be assigned a wildfire risk classification. The categories range from no risk at all, which probably a condo in the Pearl in Portland, to extreme risk, which, you know, is probably going to be somewhere more rural and possibly in the forested areas. And so based on that map and that work done, and ODF is working on that now, we have a rules advisory committee that's working on that now. OSU will then update their Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer based on those maps. And so hopefully there'll be a user-friendly portal that you can go to as a citizen and type in your address and figure out what risk classification has been assigned to you. Next slide, please. ODF, in addition to creating the risk classes for each property in Oregon, is also tasked with defining the wildland urban interface, and that's what we call the WUI. WUI, if you have any interest in wildfire issues, you will become quickly familiar with the term WUI. That's the wildland urban interface, and it really is designed to be an area where you have an interface, a mix of both urban development and wildland fuels. These are the WUI is the area where fires can spread quickly, and at the same time, not only will they spread quickly, but because of the settlement patterns in that particular area, the impact will impact a significant number of Oregonians in a quick time. It's one thing to have a single house on a 10,000 acre ranch, where if the fire spreads and burns that house, you have essentially the loss of one structure. It's quite another thing where you have 10 homes in a 10 acre area, where if a fire starts, you might impact those 10 homes relatively quickly. And so that's the concept of the WUI, and the mapping of the WUI is to get at those areas where we have a concentration of both wildland fuels and structures. And the WUI is likely to include both urban and semi-urban areas. Next slide, please. Based on both the wildfire risk assignment and the map of the WUI, then the state fire marshal, Travis's agency, will establish what are known as defensible space regulations, and for properties that are both in the WUI and classified as either high or extreme wildfire risk. Those defensible space regulations really are, you think of them as buffers. They are buffers between structures, dwellings and other outbuildings, maybe a business, and vegetative fuels. And so the idea is we're trying to create essentially ways to protect the structure, the business, the house, whatever it is, by placing some kind of, for lack of a better term, a fire break between the actual structure itself and the fuel source. Next slide, please. While OSFM, while the fire marshal is working on the defensible space standards, DCBS, the Department of Consumer and Business Services, will be working on building hardening standards. Those are building code standards that will apply in the high and extreme risk areas, and essentially require a different type of development, a different type of building to occur in those areas that are designated as high or extreme risk areas for fire. And so we might be talking about metal roofs, fire resistant siding, things of that. So if you're remodeling an existing home, or building a new home, and this applies to dwellings only, not commercial structures. But if you're doing that and you're in a high or extreme risk area, then you will probably be required by DCBS and the building code to put some different type of to use different types of materials, and it will probably increase the cost of the work to a certain extent. Next slide, please. There we go. And finally, DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, has been tasked under 762 to review existing state land use regulations to minimize wildfire risks. Now, they're not required to adopt rules by the bill, but they are required to look at the existing land use laws and report back to the 2023 legislature on what they believe needs to occur in order to update our land use system based on wildfire risk. Next slide, please. So I think the concerns for property owners are, I've listed 8. The first 3 deal with ODF's mapping. As Department of Forestry is working through its mapping, how do we accurately determine the risk categories to assign to each property? Will there be an appeals process? And what will that appeals process be for property owners who feel like the department got it wrong? It's going to be hard for any agency mapping on a parcel by parcel basis across the entire state of Oregon to get everything right. I think we all acknowledge that mistakes will be made. So what is the process for the property owner to address those mistakes? And this is critical, how will ODF determine what's in the wildland urban interface, the WUI, and what isn't? Since a number of the regulations are designed to apply to property owners in the WUI, being in or out of the WUI is a big deal and may have significant impacts on the property owner. As far as defensible space goes, the real key issue, I think, for a number of particularly rural folks, will the fire marshal under the defensible space regulations regulate farming and forest practices? Will they require the small woodlot owner to remove trees from a managed tree stand or part of a managed tree stand from around the dwelling? Will they require a farmer to remove a row of hazelnut trees from the hazelnut orchard near the barn? Will they require grandma to cut down her rose bushes in her manicured lawn outside of town? We don't know that yet. We're working through that. On the hardening requirement side, we need to be aware of the costs of what are going to be the costs of the new construction standards that the property owners will be required to implement, and factor that into the rulemaking. And then on the land use side, what new development limitations are going to be imposed on property owners? Will a use that's currently allowed by law no longer be allowed by a change in the regulations, and how will that impact property owners? That's where those are sort of the on the ground issues that we're working through now with the implementation, and that both the Wildfire Policy Advisory Council and the rulemaking advisory councils are working on now. So this is definitely a work in progress, and you need to pay attention to it if you're a property owner. So with that, I think that concludes my presentation. Happy to take questions, and then I also, on this last slide here, if you want to call, I'm happy to talk to you offline.
We have one question. Is WUI definition based on permanent homes, or does it include influx of tourist population, such as the ones we increasingly see?
I don't think the WUI definition will be based on so much on the use of the structure beyond dwelling versus commercial uses. And so I don't think it will be that nuanced to go in and have a determination of whether or not you're included in the WUI based on what's actually going on that property. I don't think the agency has that much time or expertise to go and try and make that call.
We did have one more question. Do we know if there are to be levels to the WUI, or is it binary? The parcel is in it or is out of it?
Yeah, and the answer to that is it's binary. You're either in the WUI or you're out of the WUI. And as I said, that decision will make a significant difference, I suspect, for property owners and their ability to what they can do and what they should do on their property.
No more questions at this time.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Dave. And Senator Betsy Johnson, whom I'm going to introduce in a minute, has asked you to stay on for the first part of her presentation. So let me just do her introduction and then we can get right to it. Our last speaker is another familiar face to those of us in Tillamook County. Now in her third term in the Oregon Senate, Senator Betsy Johnson brings her intelligence and commitment to giving people a fair shake in the system. Given our rural nature here, a key concern that she has watched over in her years served, we are fortunate to have Senator Johnson in our corner. She's provided a voice on behalf of EVCNB, opening doors to aid in furthering our mission, not the least of which was the much appreciated guidance in planning today's program. Senator Johnson will wrap up the guest speaker portion of our program by sharing her thoughts on what's been presented today and other legislative insights as time allows. Senator Johnson, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I get to exercise the prerogative of being the cleanup batter, and that is to do exactly what you just suggested, and that is to react to some of the presentations. I especially want to keep Dave on because there are a number of things about Senate Bill 762 that are profoundly impactful to people that are listening to this. But let me start by acknowledging the Emergency Volunteer Corps of Nehalem Bay and your role, Madam Moderator. I was around when this initiative first started under the formidable direction of Linda Kozlowski, and I want to use this forum to thank her for her dogged determination to bring this from a fledgling organization to now one of the powerhouse models in Oregon. And it's one that I have cited routinely in talking about the heavy lift that went into preparing the community to be a community of intense preparedness with an eye towards preparedness across disasters, whether it's Cascadia subduction, tsunami, wildfire. The ethos of preparedness penetrates this part of Tillamook County. And you all that are participating with EVCNR have done an enormous service to your fellow citizens. I wanted to have Mark, if he's still on, think about a question I want to pose to him. It's one that I get regularly, and it's one that's whipped on the radio frequently. And that is, once Dave and I get done talking about Senate Bill 762, if you could come back and comment on the efficacy of a huge aircraft like the Global / Evergreen 747 in fighting conflagration. I have been asked many times, why don't they just bring that big honker in and put out a fire? And if you could comment on that, I think it would be highly instructive. And I'd like to go back to my colleague and friend, Representative Evans, who doggedly worked on getting the revamp of our Oregon emergency management through the legislature. I know the frustration when you fail in one session, you come back and push it through in the second. I think his bill was refined and the legislature was educated by his lived experience as a military officer, as well as somebody who's worked for companies that prepare emergency preparedness equipment. And we are the beneficiary. I would like him to comment on what it's going to take to stand that agency up and what people's expectations should be as the next fire season rolls around all too quickly. But I want to turn my attention back to Mr. Hunnicutt. Mr. Hunnicutt and I work very closely together on a variety of things. And as Senate Bill 762, which actually morphed out of Senate Bill 1536 in the 2020 session, the Senate Bill 1536 did not move forward. And then quickly, Oregon experienced some of its worst fires to date, known, as he said colloquially, as or maybe Mark Labhart did, the Labor Day fires. There was a lot of emotion around 762 that I think is going to need to be tempered as 762 actually comes into existence. And I was very pleased that Mr. Hunnicutt laid out in his slide presentation those large global questions. There had been another bill offered, House Bill 2722, that was that stood in juxtaposition to Senate Bill 762. I was a fan of 2722, largely because it was much less top down and it was more bottom up. But as Mr. Hunnicutt pointed out, the things that are going to be touched by this omnibus wildfire bill, utilities, health systems, emergency response, this map of the wildfire risks, defensible space, which is very near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Central Oregon, over where Commissioner Labhart now lives. And in our yard are 200-foot tall, 200-year-old ponderosa pine trees. And the definition of defensible space looms very large for me if anything is brought to bear on causing those trees to have to be removed. The land use planning piece that representative, I just elevated you, Mr. Hunnicutt. The land use planning piece that Mr. Hunnicutt touched on is going to be very problematic. DLCD is not the nimblest of agencies, and it is going to ask that agency to update land use zoning and regulation, building codes. We've already had a taste of what the building code changes might be, and they are significant. Plus, LCDC will be involved in the defensible space standards. The alternate bill had created a stakeholder group to identify changes as necessary in the land use system, rather than turning this assignment and opportunity over to very frisky agencies that are always happy to be involved in changing Oregon's land use rules. The building codes piece is going to be expensive and problematic. And for people that live in forested areas, as much of Tillamook County enjoys proximity to the natural elements of trees and forest, this will affect people's day-to-day lives as they go about getting ready to build or to remodel or to make changes in their dwellings and ancillary buildings. There's a whole resiliency factor that will need to be implemented and discussed, and is complicated by the fact that Senate Bill 762 creates a new program that appears in my reading of it, and I'm asking for Mr. Hunnicutt's correction if necessary, to treat state and federal lands the same, and actually creates restrictions on where the Department of Forestry our Oregon Department of Forestry can engage in shared stewardship work. We're going to have small woodlots incentives. Both of the two competing bills that were presented to the legislature gave an incentive program for small tract forest landowners to restore forest health. But the question about how exactly that's going to work and who will qualify remains to be seen. And finally, we're going to have another, as I read the bill, level of bureaucracy that will continue to advise on these changes needed in land use, building codes, and defensible space. And I would ask Mr. Hunnicutt to react to some of the issues that I have raised from his perspective. He's been doing the time in grade on the WUI rule writing and presenting those rules as a result of a last-minute amendment that I helped engineer to 762 that caused the rule writing to occur at the Department of Forestry level rather than to be prescriptively described in the bill. Regrettably, I'm going to ask Mr. Hunnicutt to bring his superior and more current knowledge, but it is my observation that the Department of Forestry was not very flexible in talking about the WUI definition, which really will lead profound changes to many Oregonians in parts of our state that live very closely to nature and forests. So Dave, if you could comment, you just came from a WUI rule writing group. If you could comment on the latest and greatest changes, that might be very informative.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Senator. As I indicated, there's a rules advisory committee that ODF has created. The Department of Forestry has created to help them with both questions about the mapping and the risk classifications that are going to impact every single property owner, but also with the definition of WUI. And it's hard to undersell the impact that the definition of the WUI will have on property owners, not just rural property owners, but urban property owners as well. Essentially, the majority of the regulations that will be created under these various programs, and the impact of those regulations will occur for property owners that are within the wildland urban interface. And so getting the WUI definition right is critical. It's critical. It needs to be based on sound science and policy, and there needs to be a weighing of the benefits and the burdens, because the 762, the regulations that will be created under 762 will have both benefits to property owners, but also potential significant burdens. And so getting that definition of WUI right is absolutely critical. And we were concerned with 762 up until you were very helpful at the last minute to get the agency to do the rule, to do the definition. There was a definition that would have been put into statute in the bill that essentially would have designated any area where there's any human development at all in the WUI. And as we pointed out, does that mean that a rancher in Grant County with one house out in the middle of the ranch is going to be considered urban for purposes of the wildland urban interface? And the answer that we got from legislative counsel, the lawyers for the legislature, is yes. Unfortunately, whether that's good policy or not, that's what it said. Excuse me. That's what it says. And so we were able at the last minute to get that definition out of the statute and put into rulemaking, and we're working on that now.
While you catch your breath, one other comment that I will make is that I think a lot of people have in their mind that once 762 passed, that we're sort of one and done. The implementation of all of these new requirements in the legislation is going to be substantial, and it is relying on an agency that has had its fair share of troubles. When Commissioner Labhart was at Forestry, Jim Brown, during part of that time, was the state forester, and it ran like a little well-oiled machine. Since his retirement and service to Tillamook County, the agency has suffered dramatically. Under the leadership of the recently departed state forester, they were unable to bill for $100 million worth of services performed. Their board is undertaking all, that's now being corrected, I would add, but their board is being asked to undertake all kinds of new programs that will end up tying up, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of some of the Tillamook County commissioners, or at least one, large tracts of land that may exacerbate the fire problem. So it has been my theory right straight along that the Department of Forestry is being tasked by a lot of masters to do a lot of things. And it is hard to understand how an agency that suffers from multiple vulnerabilities in their computer system and their dispersed management system is going to be able to fully implement all of the requirements of 762 and provide the requisite oversight. They are undertaking a search for a new state forester. I would say that Nancy Hirsch, a longtime employee of the department who was pressed back into service, has done admirable work while she's there, but she is technically retired, and so a search now begins for a new state forester. But the ability of all of these agencies, given the multiple other tasking that they are getting from the legislature, their ability to deliver on the promise of an aggressive response to suppressing the possibility of conflagration is going to be hampered by resources, time, and the continuing strictures of COVID that have made it very difficult for state agencies to actually operate at maximum efficiency. So Dave, if you have any other reaction to my comments about the Department of Forestry, I don't mean to be overly harsh, but as a Ways and Means budget writing legislator, I have watched that agency teeter on the precipice of bankruptcy out of inattention by their former manager. And I am very dubious about whether or not they have the organizational architecture to undertake all of the requirements of Senate Bill 762.
Well, quickly, Senator, one of the things that 762 requires is that the agencies act quickly. The legislature is asking for answers quickly. I apologize for my voice, and we share your concern that the agencies are just simply not staffed to the point where they can give those answers in the time that's allotted, or at least do them with the science that they need to have to make those decisions.
Well, or have the leadership that imparts that sense of urgency. I learned yesterday that after 14 years of negotiations, a consent agreement was signed between a coastal port and DEQ. One lawyer working on that project had died during the interregnum. The other had retired. And so nimbleness on the part of our state agencies is going to be absolutely critical. And now I would turn to Representative Evans and ask, what is your prognostication for how quickly your new department can be stood up and operating at maximum productivity and efficacy?
Thank you for the question on that, Betsy. The best answer is July 1, 2023. No, I'm sorry. It's coming July 1, 2022. The Department of Emergency Management is expected to have the following tasks accomplished: the support for the Emergency Preparedness Advisory Council, the appointment and support of the Local Government Advisory Board, and the beginnings of the transfer over of the 24-hour Emergency Operations Center. I want to put an asterisk on that because the Fire Marshal's office, because of request from the governor's office, we had to do a separate task force work group to determine whether or not a standalone agency was in fact what the community wanted. I think that answer's been determined. They are going to be standing up on July 1, 2024, because something called ORS, Oregon Emergency Response System, is under the state police right now. The current plan is for the EOC at OEM, which will inherit those people, to be live 2024. I am going to be asking in the short session for those 7 positions to be moved over quicker, so that as of July 1st, 2022, we can have that 24-hour Emergency Operations Center capacity. I think that is a critical element. It is something that our committee has a bipartisan support for. It's something that's a long-term plan. We just want to move it up so that we can actually help locals in response times be ready for the next fire season. The Fire Marshal.
Go ahead, please. Forgive me for interrupting.
The Fire Marshal Plus Up will be completed by 2024. We are in the middle of discussions. We started discussions about alignment of potential new funding sources to help pay for that. But those conversations are not yet obviously complete. But the short answer is OEM will be good by July 1st, 2022. The entire package with Fire Marshal and State Police separated out and Fire Marshal where we want them by 2024 or earlier, or a certain senator I know will run me out of town.
Could you also describe for the fire personnel that may be listening to this webinar how the SPIRE grants will work and how you will go about taking applications for equipment that local agencies might desperately need but cannot afford?
Absolutely. So we are going to build upon the process that we learned through the initial SPIRE program. So here's how it works. Over the next several months, emergency managers and anybody who has an idea will be either reached out to or pushed into responding with the idea of what types of equipment needs are out there, just a general brainstorming what type of equipment is necessary for the things that we're recognizing as legitimate concerns right now. After that full list is put together, the Oregon Homeland Security Council will look at that list and try to do two things. Number one, standardize so that instead of 50 different types of generators, we focus on big, medium, and small, for example. And then also look at the priorities that are aligned with our state fire plan, our state seismic plans, et cetera, and have really two categories of priorities. Once the equipment list is determined, then there will be an outreach program that goes around the state to every agency that either is a public agency, nonprofit partner, maybe even a private entity that has an emergency support function, especially like in senior care, things like that. Any entity with an ESF function is eligible to apply. And then the grant process goes through and basically looks at where people are asking for what type of equipment most. And then those funds will be out there. With specific case of fire, there is a carve out that is not in law, but has been agreed upon between Representative Nathanson and myself and the fire service, that at least 2 million and no more than 2.5 million of the 10 million will be for specific equipment related to what we used to call urban search and rescue. That equipment, though, and I want to be very clear, can only be provided to agencies that have the training and have the personnel to actually use it. Because some of that equipment is so expensive, we want to emphasize the teams that either exist now or the teams that could exist relatively easily. And what that'll probably be is on a regional basis. Portland having one, something in Eugene two, and maybe a rural third. But we want to make sure and not give people equipment that they don't know how to use and puts them into more problems.
So that would be equipment that would be able to look inside, for lack of a more precise and technical word, a collapsed building following a tsunami or a Cascadia subduction event, looking for survivors.
Look inside, and actually equipment to be able to shape the space and get people inside and the equipment necessary for folks while inside to sustain life. Yes.
And I don't know that there is an expert remaining on this panel, but I would ask you, as someone who is very close to your constituents, and probably you're a volunteer firefighter in your private life, getting a lot of feedback, how deleterious do you think the loss of personnel out of the fire service based on the vaccine mandate is going to be? I am hearing on both sides of the issue, imperative to vaccinate, imperative to allow personal choice. But I certainly am hearing from a lot of people in the fire service that the mandate is going to profoundly affect both volunteer and professional firefighters.
Senator, I think you hit the nail on the head. I would suggest that about 10 to 15% of professional firefighters in urban and suburban districts will not be part of the force. And worse, because in many of the rural areas that can't afford a professional full-time component, you're probably going to see a larger percentage just because of other factors. And 80% of firefighters in the state of Oregon are still volunteers because we're largely a big state with some cities with a whole lot of space between and a lot of small communities. So it's a major factor, as is the training. One thing we're going to have to look at in the future is how we provide fire service and what we expect in terms of fire service throughout the state. And we were already in a critical shortage where many departments are running 3-person engines, which I think is not safe, but that's what we have to do. I think it puts us in a very bad spot.
I would agree. My email has certainly been running very hot on the issue of the loss of fire personnel and ancillary personnel, ambulance drivers, those sorts of issues. And let me just say, for anybody that's listening, fully vaccinated and encouraging others to do so. But I think that it ends up having a workforce a detrimental acceleration on workforce problems that already existed. I'm going to ask you one more question, Representative Evans, because of your expertise, and then go to Commissioner Labhart to talk about 747s, and then conclude with a little bit of time for questions. You have been very active in talking about mass care exercises and various exercises based on your expertise coming from the military. And I know that a sister agency, Department of Human Services, has gone into the housing space. They were asked to take up some of the responsibility of housing fire victims when the towns of Talent and Phoenix had completely burned down and there was no place there. And it was kind of all hands on deck. And DHS accepted, the Department of Human Services accepted the challenge to house some of those people. The Department of Human Services is apparently going into the emergency management business and thinking about conducting some mass care exercises. I would be interested in your thoughts on that, but let me just say as a precursor, when DHS reached out to me to talk about where some of these exercises might be conducted up and down the coast, I made it crystal clear to them that if they are conducted anywhere, Tillamook County, and specifically within the purview of the Emergency Volunteer Corps of Nehalem Bay, was absolutely essential. And I understand that they have been added to the list. So if you could make a quick comment, then we'll get a comment from Mark about great big airplanes putting out fires. And that will conclude our time. And I think the next piece on the program is an awards ceremony. Okay.
Well, I'll try to be very brief. The team that Ed Flick is putting together at DHS is first rate. The unfortunate reality is that because most other agencies haven't taken COOP planning or Emergency Operations Center operational planning very seriously, it looks like he's an outlier in terms of pushing things that maybe look a little more ambitious than otherwise would be seen if every other agency was actually doing what they should be doing. That said, because OEM has been in many ways constrained by current leadership priorities, Ed, for good or for ill, and again, I love Ed, he's a Charger, he has a very ambitious idea of how to help other agencies and nonprofits succeed. I happen to believe on the training ground is exactly where you learn where things start and stop and how relationships should function. I think he's got a good start, and I think in a couple of months, hopefully he'll be able to do what we have been talking about in terms of exercises. My goal is for OEM, however, to be leading the charge in terms of training and exercises for the state, because that is the actual appropriate conduit through FEMA, through the Department of Homeland Security. And I think one of the things that Ed is focused on is he's having to teach people who didn't during the contagion see an actual unified command structure, because we basically have been having 3 or 4 different agencies call themselves a unified command structure and not function that way. So the good is that Ed understands that he, in terms of the mass care, that's a function, but it is one of 18 different emergency support functions recognized in Oregon. And he's building a good framework, but we have to get on top of the horse and also learn how to exercise the other 17. And I believe that needs to be done under a coordinated effort through OEM. And that's why I've been pushing to try to get them added capacity to do that.
Thank you. Well, during this webinar, I've seen a request for a meeting flash across my screen, and I would be absolutely delighted if you would join us. I would benefit from your insight and your experience in this space. So now,
thank you,
Mr. Labhart, with the remaining minutes that we've got, could you help enlighten the people about the use of these large aircraft, or what aircraft are most efficacious in what spaces? I think that is an open question with a lot of Oregonians.
Well, I'll give you my perspective. I've seen a lot of retardant dropped on small fires all the way up to large conflagrations over my career in both Oregon and Washington. And I will tell you, and it's too bad we don't have that last slide that Doug had up there to show that little aircraft called a single engine air tanker, a SEAT, S-E-A-T. And then there's a map that shows all these little airplanes scattered all over the state. Well, why is that? And the reason for that is you want, they're most effective, seats and air tankers are most effective in the early stages of a fire when it's small. That's where they become productive. And so having a seat out there immediately attacking a fire is really, really productive. A 747 drop-in retardant makes for great TV, for great video pictures. But think about it. Where's that plane got to land? Where's it got to take off? It has to be in Portland. You can't drop a 747 into LeGrand or Klamath Falls or Grant County. And so you load that thing up in Portland. It takes an hour and something to get over to Eastern Oregon to drop its retardant. And by then the fire is big. So, and it's really, really, really expensive to fly a plane like that. So the most, and maybe Doug and Travis would want to weigh in, but the most productive is to have these single engine air tankers in the Redmond Air Base, strategically located so that you can use retardant in an effective manner. And yes, you do use it on large fires, but I can guarantee you the priority from that incident commander is going to be for life and property. And so if we got a fire that's moving toward an urban rural interface with houses and $1 million homes or even somebody's farm, they're going to do the best they can to drop that retardant near that home to try to protect it and do whatever they can to protect it. So that's where retardant can be effective. And it's mostly effective in small fuels like grass fires. You can lay a long stringer. But if you have a raging forest fire and it's a crowning fire, which means the fire's up in the crowns and running through the crowns, retardant planes are pretty ineffective on being able to stop or control that. But we're going to do everything we can to try to keep homes from burning up. And so they're going to be putting a lot of effort into that. So I'm not a real fan of the big air tanker, as you can tell.
Thank you very much. I get asked that repeatedly. Some people on this call know, but others don't. Back when I was in the helicopter business, we worked on a lot of fires. And as a result, I get questions about aircraft and fires all the time. And that 747 question has lingered there. So thank you for putting that to rest. Madam Moderator, I've gone 2 minutes over my allotted time, and for that I apologize. And I'm looking in the chat that there may be some questions, but this is your agenda. And I think all of us would stick around and answer any if any new questions have arisen, but it is your agenda and your time frame. And with that, I will cede the microphone back to you.
Thank you so much, Senator Johnson, and all of our participants today. We do have a little bit of extra time. And so I think we could take 2 or 3 of the questions if Brad, you would like to go ahead and present those questions.
Yes, to start with, there was some additional information from a participant with some experience with the 747 question. Participants want to read that, they can go to the Answered tab in the Q&A section. But our first question comes from Mark. After viewing the trauma of the California wildfires destroying paradise, killing people and destroying the town, I note that the new residential building codes there require strict fire safety measures. Will climate change bringing more heat and fires north to Oregon, as we witnessed last fall? Many could argue this new Senate bill is quite weak. Can we expect expanded state and federal money to help implement even stricter fire safety codes?
I'll take a crack at it just to get things started. The real answer is I don't know. In order to have the legislature act, you've got to secure adequate votes to be able to move a bill forward. It's difficult to opine on a bill that one hasn't read. There will be costs associated with this, and there will be interest groups that will object to it. There will be communities of interest, homeowners, groups that have designed certain characteristics for their communities that might take exception to a bill. So without seeing the 4 corners of the bill, I can't answer the questioner's question precisely. I'm sure that there will be a push to have that kind of concept debated in the legislature. Its chances for success remain to be seen.
Our next question is from Andy. What do we know about how private property insurers will respond to property owners who do or those who do not take the preemptive wildfire precautions?
So I can take a quick hit on that because we had a work group during the legislative session having to do with this, and then I'll pass it off to Mr. Hunnicutt, who I know has been involved, as our office has been, in terms of the discussions about 762. There is a keen recognition that what underwriters knew 30 years ago about the world and how they price things are no longer necessarily aligned with realities. And there's a ongoing discussion how much of the weight, if you will, of this changing reality is on the individual holder versus the public versus on the private insurance company that seeks to make a profit, quote unquote, off of that effort. We had a bill, actually Representative Marsh had a bill that would levy a new kind of fee that's really targeted for wildfire mitigation. I introduced a bill that was a conversation starter because it made everybody mad to try to have the conversation about how we figure out to move forward. I can just say from the public policy perspective, we all have a stake in making sure that insurance is affordable. We also all have a recognition that the costs of doing that are a lot different if the trends continue in terms of the price of catastrophe and those types of retrofitting costs. So very much part of the conversation going on. I suspect in the next 2 or 3 years, there'll actually be a series of approaches that are some type of partnership between public monies as well as private and individual policyholders.
And I'll just add to that, we had some really interesting discussions with the representatives of the insurance, property insurance industry during the discussions on Senate Bill 762. And there really isn't a clear answer to that question at this point. One thing that significantly concerns us is a recognition that for a lot of folks in rural Oregon, the demographic out there is you're reaching an older and a poorer population, and so the impact on that on property insurance rates will be felt keenly and significantly by folks in rural Oregon who are most likely to be, or who will certainly be impacted by Senate Bill 762.
Okay, well, I hate to end this very, very interesting component of the webinar, but we are just about out of time. And I wanted to, again, thank all of our guests for very, very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Last on our agenda today is presentation of the Emergency Volunteer Corps of Nehalem Bay Volunteer Awards. While it's awkward to carry this out via Zoom, we feel it is important to carry on this annual tradition. Last year, these awards were announced at our very last in-person meeting in March 2020, a long 18 months ago. We fervently hope that next year we will again be able to present our awards in person. This afternoon, I'm announcing 2 awards. The first is the Volunteer of the Year, and the second is the Harshbarger Award, which is given to an outstanding CERT member in memory of Bill Harshbarger, who was instrumental in building our CERT program. This year's Volunteer of the Year goes to the COVID-19 response team. This team responded to the COVID-19 crisis by volunteering with Tillamook County Community Health, initially by helping with contact tracing, and then by helping to staff the many vaccine clinics that have so far brought Tillamook County to a 63% vaccination rate. That's 63% of the total population. COVID-related volunteer hours in calendar year 2021 add up to more than 2,500 hours. Volunteers include both Medical Reserve Corps members giving vaccinations and recently also helping with COVID testing, and CERTs who have served as greeters and monitors and helped with parking for vaccine recipients. This effort has been made possible by the extraordinary leadership of 3 individuals who will receive the awards. The first 2 awards go to Velda Handler and Kate Grimm, who are the co-leads of the Medical Reserve Corps of Nehalem Bay. And the third leader on the COVID-19 response team is Joe Cooper, the CERT program lead. COVID-19 is still a crisis, and EVCNB will continue to work with the health department for as long as we're needed. And interestingly, none of the awardees are present today because they are working vaccine clinics in Tillamook. This year's Harshbarger Award was chosen by the CERT leadership team and goes to another repeated name, Joe Cooper, the CERT lead, for her tireless leadership and creativity as CERT moves forward. Congratulations to all 3 awardees. We look forward to presenting your awards in person as soon as we can gather safely again. Okay, that concludes our presentation for today. Again, we want to thank our speakers for their valuable information and participation in this webinar. We hope that our audience has found this information useful. Thank you all so much for attending. Please look out for our follow-up email tomorrow in your inbox. We will provide you with our YouTube channel so that you can revisit today's program, as well as other EVCNB videos. We will also invite you to our website to review our newest information on wildfires, and we also encourage you to visit our events and training page and consider registering for something in the arena of emergency preparedness that is of interest to you. Remember, be prepared, not scared, and get your vaccine. Thank you.